Welcome to this week's Crossroads Politics here on WTHR+. I'm Dustin Grove, and we begin with new developments this week on the biggest development project in Indiana history. 2 pieces of land for that project are now up for sale. Our news gathering partners at the Indiana Capital Chronicle report the land up for sale was originally going to be part of Boone County's multi-billion-dollar LEAP Innovation District. Now the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, the IEDC, is reselling some of that land it bought for the project. Our State House reporter Emily Longnecker traveled to that area to talk with neighbors about it this week and to bring people up to speed. Emily, critics of this project have argued the state shouldn't get involved in land development. Right. Others have said the state bit off more than it can chew. So what did you learn this week from neighbors?
Well, some of them think that this is a much bigger sign of the LEAP district's future. Governor Braun recently announced an audit of how that agency does business. Members of a preservation group in Boone County think that audit and now the sale of this land point to something they've believed all along, that the IEDC has been acting like a property developer and didn't think the LEAP project all the way through.
When this for sale sign went up recently for the property and house right behind Brian Daggie's house in Boone County, Daggie took it as a sign of something much bigger.
I think it's probably a sign of the fact that maybe somebody, particularly under the new administration, has realized that IEDC overspent, overbought, maybe bit off more than they can chew in terms of how they're trying to acquire property.
Daggie's part of the Boone County Preservation Group and says more than 3 years ago, the IEDC offered to buy his land along with several of his neighbors.
And they were kind of like a drunken sailor out here buying property.
Daggie and most of his neighbors turned them down, except the property owner who lived behind Daggie, who sold his land and house to the state. Now the house and part of the land, along with this other home and the acre of land it sits on, are back on the market. The second home sits just north of where Eli Lilly is setting up shop in the LEAP district. Property records show the IEDC bought the second home and land for $840,000. The asking price now, $649,000.
Buying high, selling low is not a good way to make money.
A spokesperson with the IEDC confirmed to 13 News it has 2 properties listed for sale and that they're in the process of looking at all land they own within the LEAP district. The spokesperson said the 2 properties were necessary to the project at one point for access and annexation. That's not the case now. The IEDC says it's selling portions of the properties to eliminate maintenance costs and better align with the long-term vision for the site. A vision neighbors like Brian Daggie still question, with Eli Lilly so far the only company who's broken ground in the LEAP district.
And that groundbreaking actually happened last week, and that is where Lebanon's mayor told 13 News that he expects more companies to set up shop in the LEAP district.
You mentioned the governor has called for an audit of IEDC. Where does that stand right now?
So just this week, the governor picked who would do that audit. Our partners at the Capital Chronicle report the governor signed a contract with FDI Consulting for forensic review and support services. The contract is worth $800,000 and started on May 13th. That money is going to come out of the IEDC's own funds. The audit will be carried out in partnership with the Indiana Inspector General's office. The governor's spokesperson says that FTI will start working on that audit immediately.
So when can we expect a progress report, do you think?
So not until the end. The governor's office saying that when they're done with the audit, that's when we'll know what came out of that audit.
All right, Emily, thank you very much. I know you'll keep track of it. Still ahead, student IDs and voting.
I don't think that's a valid argument by any means because students in Indiana are going to vote how they please.
A lawsuit challenges a new law targeting campus voters. Next, here on Crossroads Politics. Indiana's Secretary of State is facing a lawsuit over a new law that prohibits college students from using their college IDs to vote. That law was passed in this year's legislative session, and Emily, you spoke with one of the groups involved in this.
Yeah, that lawsuit was filed by 2 nonpartisan nonprofits who work with voter advocacy and an IU student. That student is from out of state, and up until the passage of this new law, he used his student ID to vote. The lawsuit calls the new law a, quote, surgical attack on young voters.
Super simple.
That's how IU college student Anushka Pandey describes casting her ballot in last year's presidential election, the first one she was old enough to vote in. Pandey's from Carmel, but was going to school at IU at the time.
I went to vote early in Monroe County. I presented my Crimson card, and they scanned it, and that was it.
The next time she votes, though, Pandey won't be able to use her college ID after lawmakers passed a law banning their use as proof of identification to vote. Pandey was one of several people who testified this year at the State House against the proposed bill.
Essentially, it goes against voting rights.
That's basically what this lawsuit against Indiana Secretary of State Diego Morales, the Indiana Election Division, and the Monroe County Board of Elections alleges.
We're indicating that this puts an undue burden on students.
Women for Change Indiana is one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit. Part of the nonprofit's work deals with voter registration and voter turnout on college campuses. They say the new law will now mean even more work surrounding voter education for college students.
We're going to have to do additional training. We're going to continue to have to advance the conversation with young people in particular, that they need to have their ID, not that their college ID will work.
13 News reached out to the author of SEA 10, Republican State Senator Blake Dorio, for comment on the lawsuit, but did not receive a response. During the legislative session, Dorio said student IDs didn't have the same kind of scrutiny or rigor as driver's licenses, and that this would keep people from voting who didn't have the proper ID. Those against the law, like Anushka Pandey, say the law is a solution without a problem.
They haven't produced any evidence of this type of voter fraud in general.
Now, the law is set to go into effect on July 1st, and it asks for an injunction, meaning the lawsuit asks them to hold off, the state to hold off from implementing this law until a court can decide whether it's constitutional or not.
Okay, so what does the Secretary of State have to say about it?
Well, he supports the law, and he sent us a statement saying voting is a sacred right and it must be safeguarded through consistent and reliable security standards. He went on to say the new law ensures that IDs used at the polls are secure and that only eligible Hoosiers are voting in Indiana.
All right, Emily, thanks. Still ahead, what is it like being an undocumented immigrant here in Indianapolis?
We wanted to tell their stories and really get to know them, both their fears and their hopes.
We have an extended interview with the journalists from Mirror Indy who looked at how life has changed for Indy's immigrant community under the Trump administration. Next on Crossroads Politics. Welcome back. Across the country, undocumented immigrants are being deported, and that includes, of course, here in Indianapolis. Two journalists with Mirror Indy went out to find out how the new administration's policies are impacting those undocumented immigrants here in our community, the larger community. They sat down with us here at 13 News to share what they learned. We're back now with a closer look at the immigration debate, specifically how the administration's policy is affecting Mexican immigrants here in Indianapolis.
So we're joined by Mirror Indy reporters Jennifer Delgadillo and Mary Claire Malloy, who took a deep dive into this issue, and they have spent months putting their story together. And this is really a comprehensive approach to telling these people's stories, afforded an opportunity that we don't always get here with television. And so what went into, I guess, presenting this to the people? What was the backstory leading up to this?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having us. We decided as a team in our newsroom to tackle different stories and angles on immigration. And for us, that meant looking for a human narrative. That meant talking to our neighbors, and we kind of centered in on Mexican immigrants because they make up the largest group in the city, and this is an increasingly international city. So we wanted to tell their stories and really get to know them, both their fears and their hopes, why they're here, what they love about this city.
How many Mexican immigrants are there in the city?
30,000 is my understanding.
Wow. And so I think that was interesting how you all approached the article in that sense, because we are having this growing diverse group here in Indianapolis, and you wanted to share these people, specifically a story that we don't get a chance to really see on the local level. How are you hoping people relate to their narrative?
Well, what we discovered while working on this is that Mexican immigrants are part of Indianapolis culture in general. They work in every industry. You know, you go to restaurants, nonprofits, hospitals, you will see, they're part of the economy, our friendships, our neighborhoods, our families. And so really the impact is everywhere.
And I thought it was interesting that you strayed away from the politics, the political debate, and focused really on the human impact. Was that a conscious decision?
Yeah, starting off this narrative, we knew that there's politics, pundits everywhere. We're aware of this administration promising the largest deportation in American history, but we wanted to take a step back from the torrent of news and just really focus on people, their daily lives, those stories that can get lost when we're talking about politics.
And what you showed is that people are literally living in fear. Can you explain a little bit more of their predicament, what they're experiencing?
Yeah, so what it looks like is that things change every day, and attitudes might be a little more hostile for certain people. We heard from a couple of people who had experienced hostile experiences just by going out shopping during their normal everyday things. And so that's making it so they want to stay home, or they might not feel safe. And you see their younger children who are American citizens, stepping up and protecting their parents, which is something unusual that you don't see in all families.
And people have spent decades living like this.
Some of these fears are new, but yes.
And I think you're talking about Rosara, right? Juan and Rosara, they'd been here 20 years, now have 5 children. In your story, you write, together they built a life here, joining a tight-knit community of Mexican immigrants, adding their culture to the fabric of the city. You write that they crossed 20 years ago, are living here without legal permission, but they've had their 5 children here who are U.S. citizens. You wrote that she actually thought at one point, maybe we should just sell our house and move back to Mexico. And Juan said, this is your because this is your children's country. I wonder if they or the people you spoke with have any regrets. Would they have done anything differently?
It didn't feel that way to me. So something that is not new and that maybe wasn't expressed in this story is that there is a history of immigration that goes back a long time. So when people made these decisions 20 years ago, it might not have seemed as big of a deal as it seems right now. So you see now that some immigrants are like changing their minds or maybe not making that choice. But 20 years ago, it's a culture. There's been Mexican immigrants here in Indianapolis for a very long time. Your grandparents had neighbors that were Mexican immigrants. Your parents had neighbors that were Mexican immigrants. And so what they did, for them, it was just like a brave change for their life to improve their family.
Now, there are people who actually see immigration as a real issue that can't be ignored. What do you want them to gather from your article in sharing these personal stories?
I think just taking a second to look at the human impact politics and policies have on people, getting a sense that the city you're living in is maybe more international and diverse than you think. A lot of these communities, as the second administration has started, felt like they've been pushed into the shadows, but they're there. They're at your church, they're at your school, they're everywhere, and they're our neighbors. So think of it that way.
That was one thing Dustin and I were discussing this morning, is that we are all kind of living in our bubble, but the numbers for Indianapolis show that there is that increasing diversity that we talked about. But isn't it amazing how we just all end up kind of sometimes living in our circle? It's interesting.
Yeah, I think through our work, even us that might know, personally, I am a Mexican immigrant, so I know a lot of people, but even so, like being curious about the experiences of others, like I learned a lot too. There are so many different paths to immigrating to a different country, and I think we try to show that, like the different ways, the different permits, the different statuses.
I like your point there, because a lot of times people think it's just what you see on the news, and the narrative goes beyond that of what you showed in your article.
It's much more complex when you have people who've lived here for 20 years and their kids are American citizens, and what happens if you separate a family like that, or that's something they're grappling with. That's a big fear for them.
Dustin, you said that earlier. You said there's black and there's white and then there's a ton of gray area.
Yeah, well, as we've seen, there's really there's no simple answer. No matter where you land or what you believe in the immigration debate, no answer to fix it is simple. It's going to take a lot. What I'm curious to know, the people you spoke with, do they have a solution to the immigration issue in America?
You know what's interesting? We didn't hear a lot of that. Like, we didn't hear what they wished things were like. I think what they expressed was their wish of why they moved here. And that was to have a more peaceful, happy life. Yeah. And so I think it's shocking too that, there are different sets of problems in their countries of origin.
Yeah.
And those problems are so different from the ones they're experiencing here. And I think they're weighing, like which one's worse.
You wrote definitely about the American dream. That was a recurring theme.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have you all spoken to anyone in your other reporting journeys or experiences that had any interesting viewpoints about immigration and possible solutions to them?
We've really been focused on these narratives for several months. So we've talked to attorneys, immigration attorneys, who say things are changing so rapidly, and getting some clarity and knowing what they're dealing with, and court cases and the administration's stances. So that's really what we've heard, is just how hard it is to stay on top of things, but mostly we focused on this narrative.
Well, thank you for staying on top of it. Great work. Really enjoyed hearing the voices and the perspectives in your piece, and all of the work that you're doing at Mirror Indy. Thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
And that does it for this week's episode of Crossroads Politics. We are taking next week off for the Memorial Day holiday and the race, but you can watch us every other week at 10 a.m. on Sunday or on demand anytime here on WTHR+. For Emily Longnecker, I'm Dustin Grove. Thanks so much for watching. We hope to see you next time.